I'm going to use a mixture of wet in wet and wet onto dry to create some special effects, plus some glazing. Here I'm starting to just wet the piece of paper just with clean water down to a certain level before I start. When it's completely wet, what I'm going to do is mix up a colour, a greyish colour, with French ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'm going to use that as a kind of grey as the first layer in, and I put it in quite freely and then mix in a little raw sienna into it. And as I'm doing it, I'm already thinking it's a bit too light. So I'm mixing in the raw sienna, but then I decide I'm going to go in a bit darker at the top. And you can do that when it's wet in wet. I thought I would show you a process to create a sun, if ever you need it. You take a coin, you wrap it in some kitchen roll quite tightly, and then you press down on the surface of the damp paper. If you do that for a second or two, hey presto, you've got a sun. I'm using the Harke brush in this process, and I'm squeezing it out and mopping up the excess moisture that's at the bottom of where I've painted. Now I've decided that I'm going to mix up some more of that pigment to make it a little darker in the sky. It's still a bit too light, and I can do this whilst it's still wet. And I don't have to worry about that sun. The pigment will run around it. So that's quite good. It'll create a good effect. I'm drying off the surface now with the hairdryer, but not too much. It's not too dry, and so I'm adding some more mixed up grey with the burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. And as you can see, it's bleeding slightly into the background and creates a sort of slightly softened edge. So things can seem slightly murky and mistier. And this is what you get with the wet in wet technique. You can see what happens when I try to add the next layer and it's much too wet. It just runs everywhere. So now I'm going to have to wait for that to dry, and when it does dry, you can see that it's created some blooms. These are the dreaded blooms we all have in watercolour. So either I can just obliterate it, as I'm doing, or you could utilise it and paint behind it and accentuate it. This layer is going on now, and it's much drier. The surface is much drier, so the edge to the layer that I'm putting on is more clearly defined. And you may not want it as clearly defined. You may want, again, a sort of mistiness appearing. And if you do, that's when you perhaps have to damp it down again. I've let this surface dry a little too much, so it's sort of creating some hard outlines in the trees that I'm painting. So what I'm going to do is use the little spray bottle to soften off the tops of those trees a little. And you can always do that to soften off any layer that you put on, that it's too hard, where the edges are too hard. I think it's looking a bit like a little snow scene. So now I'm using the little spray bottle just to dampen the edges of those trees and soften them off a little, just to blur them, let them bleed slightly into the background. You could leave it as it is, as a sort of little winter scene, but I've decided to press on further. And I wanted to show you a technique called glazing. Here I've mixed up some raw sienna, a very thin glaze. I'm applying it with the Harke brush to a third of the image. What a glazing technique does is that it unifies the image so that discordant colours can be brought together and unified. It also creates a certain ambience. The painting has to be completely dry, otherwise it would dislodge the colour. I'm also going to show you it with green, and that will produce a much murkier effect. but at least you can see the different effects that it has on a dry painting, with the green, the centre being the original, and the rather lovely raw sienna on the right-hand side. So I hope you've learned a little about wet into wet and wet into dry, and how to utilise that for your own purposes. This wasn't about making a landscape, it's about using the processes of watercolour in order to create something that you want to make, something that you want to do. And it's worth exploring all the possibilities. Here's a couple of images of little watercolour sketches using the same process. In this one, I've simply used the commercial Payne's grey or neutral tint, which makes it easier because you're not mixing the colour all the time. When you mix a pigment, the colours tend to separate, and you may like that, but it is much easier if you just use a single pigment, as I have here with the neutral tint. You can try out these processes to create different effects in your landscape, or indeed any other painting that you're doing.